You know, the immigration issue is really going to raise the question about whether our leaders and our politicians have courage. And unfortunately, that's in pretty short supply these days in our political leadership of both parties. I spoke a little bit about immigration yesterday, but I've been thinking a lot more about it. And if you look at the polls, and this is where the question of leadership comes up, apparently 51% of the people polled, and you know, polls, you take them with a grain of salt, think that the Arizona law is just about right. Now, because most of our politicians only think about getting reelected and have no spine and no courage, and I say that in a bipartisan way, sift through the polls and listen to their consultants and say, you have to do this on immigration, this being make sure you're hard on security, hard on enforcement, and basically the debate is going to be from the center to the right. And I said yesterday, the real issue about immigration is whether we have the courage to admit that most of the immigration that's coming to this country is being influenced and encouraged by the economic policies of the United States of America, in particular free trade, which has been a total disaster, and in particular NAFTA, a trade agreement that I fought against way back in the 1993 when it was passed and pushed by a Democratic president. It began, I believe, a disastrous series of awful trade agreements and awful policy that has lowered wages, impoverished people here and around the world, and forced people to leave their land and flow across borders. But our politicians, having no courage and believing in the so-called free market at any cost, are going to pander to, I think, the fear that people have about their livelihoods. And what I think needs to be done in this debate is to step back and say, look, people, the immigrants, the people coming to our country, undocumented immigrants, they're economic refugees. They're in the same boat as working people in America. We have to treat them civilly. We have to understand that if we want to deal with the immigration issue, we first have to take a hard look at what the United States is doing to promote and force people off their land or force them into jobs that reduce people's wages. This is a global problem, and unless we take ownership over the responsibility that we have in creating the immigration flow all across borders, not just into this country, but all across the world, we will not solve it. So the question is, are we going to have courage? Now, my opponent will not have courage because she simply flip-flops and will do whatever it takes to get elected. At one point, she was an immigrant basher. Now she's flipped over. As someone noted in a column, nobody knows what her real position and principles are. The voters of New York should not take any solace, any comfort in the notion that Kirsten Gillibrand will have any position that you can count on, certainly not in protecting immigrants. We need a serious debate about immigration. It requires that we dig deep, look at what our responsibility is as a country in forcing people off their land, change those policies, treat people with dignity and respect, make sure they can make a solid living, and that's how we're going to address immigration.